Hello, and welcome to this evening's Brookline Booksmith virtual event with author Dylan Marron to celebrate conversations with people who hate me in conversation with Sarah Kay. My name is Rachel, and I'm a bookseller at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. And as per your request, Dylan, this is the last event rather that I am doing tonight. And so this is a very special one to share with all of you. If you're familiar with our store and our event series, it's really wonderful to have you back. And if this is your first time with us, welcome. We're so happy to have you all here as part of our Booksmith community tonight and really appreciate your support of an independent bookstore and truly fabulous authors through your participation and through your book purchases. Now, this evening, we are thrilled to have Dylan and Sarah with us. Moderator Sarah Kay is a writer, performer, and educator from New York City. She has shared her poems in cornfields in Iowa, an orthodontist office in Nepal, a Viking ship on a fjord in Norway, a nightclub in Singapore, the Royal Danish Theatre in Denmark, Carnegie Hall in New York City, the Kennedy Center in DC, the back rooms of dive bars, middle school gymnasiums, and once on top of someone's dining room table. Sarah has a master's degree in the art of teaching from Brown University and has been a Hedgebrook artist in residence, a Serembi artist in residence, a Kunman Fellow, and is a class of 2022 New Arizona Fellow at New America. Sarah is the author of 4 books of poetry, No Matter the Wreckage, B, The Type, and All Our Wild Wonder, and is the founder and co-director of Project Voice, an organization that uses poetry to entertain, educate, and inspire students and teachers worldwide. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Sarah.
Hello.
Now I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's guest author, called The Modern Mr. Rogers by Jason Sudeikis. Dylan Marron is the host and creator of the critically acclaimed podcast, Conversations with People Who Hate Me, a social experiment that connects adversarial internet strangers through phone calls. He recently joined the writing staff of the Emmy-winning hit television series Ted Lasso. Dylan is also the voice of Carlos, an international podcast sensation, Welcome to Night Vale, an alum of the New York Neo-Futurist Theater Company, the creator of Every Single Word, a video series that edits down popular films to feature only the words spoken by people of color, and was a writer and correspondent at Seriously TV, where he created, hosted, and produced programs such as Sitting in Bathrooms with Trans People. Conversations with People Who Hate Me was selected as a podcast pick by USA Today and The Guardian, named the timeliest podcast by Fast Company, won a Webby Award, and was the subject of Dylan's 2018 TED Talk. Empathy is not endorsement. Dylan lives in Brooklyn, New York with his husband, Todd, and we couldn't be happier to have him here with us tonight. Now this evening, Dylan and Sarah will be sharing conversations with people who hate me. After years of production and dozens of phone calls, Dylan shares an exploration of difficult conversations, what he's learned, and how these interactions can ultimately help us close the growing distance between us, serving as a guide to anyone partaking in difficult conversations and a permission slip to those who dare to believe that connection is possible. It's a true honor to have them both here with us tonight. Please join me now in welcoming Dylan and Sarah.
Yay! Thank you, Rachel.
Yay! Thank you, Rachel.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Dylan.
Hi, Sarah. This is so exciting. I'm going to take a picture of you.
Oh, no. Wait.
No, I want it. Oh, wow. Yeah, we got to get the merch in there. Wow. Okay, I got it.
Amazing. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Brookline Booksmith, for having us. Thank you, Dylan, for writing this beautiful book and for inviting me to chat with you about it. I read this in a single plane ride and cried, laughed. The person next to me knew that I was going through it, underlined constantly, took a lot of notes. So I have so many things I want to ask you about. But can you start by telling us a little bit about, so there's Conversations with People Who Hate Me started as a podcast, and now there is also a book called Conversations with People Who Hate Me. So
yes, my life is branded.
Yes. And there soon will also be a sock line.
Yeah, called Conversations with People Who Hate Me.
Yes. But could you maybe, just for folks who maybe are super new to you and your work, can you tell us a little bit about what the podcast was and maybe like the project of the podcast, and then how that's different from what the book is and the project of the book?
Great question, my queen. First of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this. I just want to say publicly on the record, I'm a huge Sarah Kay stan. I have told Sarah Kay so many times privately how much I love her and her work, and now I'm saying it publicly, so deal with it. So yes, so conversations with people who hate me, this is the most bare bones version. I was making very popular work on the internet. That work was receiving hate online, as popular work receives. And I decided to start speaking one-on-one to some of the people I felt safe enough speaking to who were sending me hate messages. And so for the first season, well, I started recording those conversations with their consent, and I released it as episodes of my podcast, Conversations with People Who Hate Me, that started in 2017. After the first season, I expanded the show to start moderating conversations between strangers who got into it with each other. And the podcast has been going on for 5 years now. It's ongoing. And the book distills the 12 lessons I've learned from doing the show. And I think one thing to just kind of drive home is that this whole project started specifically with my learning how to have difficult conversations with internet strangers. But I think the really cool thing that I've heard from listeners and readers now alike is that it's a fill in the blank, right? Like, this is a guide for difficult conversations with whatever your blank may be. Mine is internet strangers, yours might be family members, friends, ex-friends, people who you no longer speak to. Whatever that difficult conversation is about, this is kind of a guide for navigating those conversations.
Awesome. So the sort of like different goals or the project of the podcast as it became like a book project is maybe like a little different, right? That this is now becoming a template and a guide of possible that someone else could possibly follow. Whereas
exactly
the podcast, that wasn't necessarily part of the plan, right?
Not part of the plan. That was really just to broadcast what these conversations were sounding like. I wanted to bring it to the public square because I thought there was a lack of that. And I still think there's a lack of that, to be totally honest.
I wanted to also just give a shout. We're talking about the book and mainly want to talk about the book, but also I have been a Dylan fan for a very long time, doing a lot of different projects of yours. And I really love thinking about like the common denominator of the breadth of someone's work, or like the sort of beating heart behind, like the why behind all of the different hows. And so you have a lot of like really tremendous projects that were successful in and of their own right. But I'm curious if you think that like either they're all part of a kind of a larger personal project of your person in the world, whether this book is now like a new avenue with a new goal in mind. If they all like sort of are raised from the same son of Dylan, or like what is what's the common denominator, I guess, is the sort of cruder way of putting it.
Raised from the same
the connective
son.
Tissue between these.
That is poet Sarah Kay asking questions. It's beautiful. So I love this question because I've only actually articulated it even to myself a few years ago. So I would say my biggest projects have been Every Single Word, that edited down popular films to only the words spoken by people of color. Sitting in Bathrooms with Trans People, that was a web series where I did exactly what the title suggested I might do. I sat down with my trans friends in bathrooms as a way to humanize the people who were at the center of the transphobic bathroom laws that were gaining media attention around the country. This was in spring of 2016. Conversations with People Who Hate Me is about taking people who would otherwise never speak with each other and connecting them on a phone call. To me, and I also think that the underlying theme of my work is also up to the viewer, because I think when you make public work, you're also kind of releasing it from you in a sense, and you're giving license to the people who consume your work to define it for themselves. But I hope the creator's account counts for something. And I will say that for me, the through line is that all three of those projects identify empathy voids and tries to address the problem. With every single word, that project is asking, what are we doing to our conscious minds when we are feeding ourselves stories through these mass empathy machines, movies, that consistently relegate people of color to the sidelines, right? Like, that's not teaching overt racism, but it's subliminal, right? Like, we are building empathy for this main character, and we think a main character or protagonist looks a certain way. So the empathy deficit there is with people of color. And what I was feeling so many times as I was watching the conversation erupt around these bathroom bills that were being proposed in spring of 2016 is that they operate in the way that so many of these fear-based laws operate, which is that they depend on people not knowing the person who is othered or a person who falls into that category. And then you can make people terrified of that thing, and then you can legislate based on that fear. And by convincing people that that is the boogeyman, like the boogeyman is going to come get you. And I thought there was such a lack of humanity for the people that were being legislated against. So I wanted to very simply, literally show the image of a trans person in a bathroom talking about the most mundane shit. Like, I'm talking like, we talked about guilty pleasure reality TV shows, snacks they liked. We also talked about bigger things like transitioning and when they decided to go about that. But I think kind of finding Whitney Houston is playing outside, and I hope you guys can hear it. And if you can't, I'm really sorry. Anyway, and then conversations with people who hate me is a little more complicated, because those two projects fall very squarely in line with progressivism, right? Like, they fall in line with, the social justice edicts that I believe in. I think conversations with people who hate me complicates that a little bit, but to me still falls in the same category, because it's identifying this lack of empathy. The tagline of the podcast is, remember there's a human on the other side of the screen. The complicated thing about that is that goes both ways, right? It's both for the person who is about to type the thing to the person. If I'm going to say something really nasty to you, Sarah, I have to remember you're a human being and you have feelings. So when I say something nasty to you, you're going to feel something about that. And then the complicated thing is the person who wrote that, unless they're a bot, is also a human being too. And that's the really challenging stuff to grapple with, which is why I think, every single word I dedicated a few months to. Sitting in bathrooms with trans people, I did for 2 months. This is something I dedicated 5 years to, and it's still going, because I think I've found something, I've hit on something that I think really fascinates me, and I don't know, maybe I'm just at the beginning of my journey with it, or maybe this is the culmination and this is my little diploma. I don't know. I'm living day to day, babies.
We're here right now,
We're here.
Thank you for that. I think it's a lot of times, at least in my life, I feel like I'm sort of like doing a project. And it isn't until I look backwards and go like, oh, here's
That's
the line. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I think being able to see that is so powerful, to be able to see like, what is your priority, and like, what is the thing, what are you working on, capital W working on?
Just to jump in, I think I also can't do that until I look back. And, I just had the privilege of doing this project for so long that I can look back while still doing this project, so like, I also think it's really complicated. Like, my artistic projects always kind of fizzle when I start with a like, well, what is my thing? My thing is identifying scarcity of empathy. And it's like, then I'm create a project that's like doing drag of myself, where I'm like performing what I think Dylan would do. And then it kind of ends up being a little soulless. And so I suspect and hope that whatever I do next is not guided by me being like, all right, let's present it to the board of, the board in my mind, and do this PowerPoint presentation of what fits in the empathy scarcity. You got to be led with your soul a lot of the times.
So I think that sometimes people, or I have been referred to as like a champion for empathy. And like a champion for, not a champion of, it's not winning at it, but like to champion the verb, like championing of empathy and championing of vulnerability. And I would wager that you probably are now certainly like a vocal champion of empathy. And I know that there's like a real, you talked so beautifully about it in the book. I've also heard you speak in an episode of your podcast recently about like criticism of the project, or like possible criticisms of this capital W work. And I too have thought a lot about, like, I very strongly believe in empathy. I believe that, like, when I stand on stage and share a poem that is vulnerable and personal, that I am like modeling a level of vulnerability and modeling a trust in a room that they will be able to show me the empathy I know they can, because they have many times before, and that sometimes they don't know they can until they're doing it. So I, as someone who like waves the banner for empathy, also think a lot about the sort of like criticism of the project of trying to infuse empathy into a space where there hasn't been. And I guess I'm curious about, like, do you think that empathy is like on the side of hope instead of on the side of cynicism? Like, when my cynicism sets in is really when I'm like, well, where's the conservative Dylan Marron? Who's doing this work on the other side of the aisle?
Yeah.
Why is Dylan the only one working this hard to like show empathy to people? Like, I get like, I want to, like, the cynicism comes in when I start to doubt that, like, the infusion of empathy is always needed. And then my sort of hopeful side is like, well, actually, nothing is possible without it. And like, the modeling of empathy is something that, like, you don't know who is going to benefit from it, when and in where in their lives they're going to have. But I'm curious if, like, you see a hopefulness in the fight for empathy, or whether, like, that's not on that grid for you.
No, I definitely see a hope in it. I think I also, it's kind of a daunting thing to carry this project into the public square. And there's a lot of cynicism right now in the public square, a lot of which I think is earned. If we want to get complex about it, which, why not? Let's get complex about it. I also think that a lot of cynicism, especially in the digital public square, is very performed, because we're communicating on platforms that champion cynicism, because they're often the pieces of text that travel the furthest, And so I think that I do think we're living in a time where people are rightfully pointing out, like, well, talking to each other is not going to fix everything. And to that I say, you're absolutely right, because conversation itself is not a practical political strategy, right? It's just in the same way that kindness isn't a viable, implementable political strategy. But just because those things aren't viable alone doesn't mean we shouldn't practice them. And just because critics of my project will say, like, we need way more than conversation. We need way more than conversation to move towards that bright, big future. And to that I say, yes, correct. I agree. I've said this many times, especially on this book tour, and I repeat it only because it continues to be true and it doesn't feel overused to me, the person who is repeating it. So I'll say that, like, I do believe that conversation is a form of activism. But I also believe and know that that activism is a mosaic, and you can only be responsible for your tile in that mosaic. And some people's tile is education, and some people's tile is speaking to their own community. My tile, I've learned, is speaking to people who disagree with me. And my tile not only doesn't negate another tile, it actually needs the other tile to create the bigger picture of change. And so I think empathy does feel hopeful to me. I think hope gets a pretty vocal eye roll in a lot of spaces these days. And I think that's a shame, because I think that's a misunderstanding of what people who are actively and consciously advocating for hope are doing. I totally get that just putting a bumper sticker on your car that says empathy, it's not going to change the world. I think shaming people who have exhausted their opportunities for conversation, who are then taking to other means to get their point across, like protest, I never want my work to be used as a shaming device for other people, and it should never be, right? I'm privileged to do this. I like doing this. I feel well suited to do this. And I also think that more people are well suited to do this than I think there are more people than they think. What is sentence construction? There are more people than, you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, more people are suited to this than know that they're suited to this.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I was like, syntax. But you got it. I think people are rightfully scared of conversation these days, not only because it feels difficult digitally in our digital landscape, but also because there's punishment for it. There's punishment from your own tribe for transgressing, for the possibility of transgressing. And I think we all have the capacity. More of us have the capacity than we think, correct the syntax, but to have these kind of difficult, radical conversations.
I was thinking, tell me if this is just like a totally incorrect, like association to make, but
no,
I was, when I was reading this book, and then I listened to your conversation with a couple other people about this project,
mm-hmm.
and I was like, oh, you know what it feels like? It feels like Dylan like tried out he like made up a diet for himself. And he was like, whoa, this diet like makes me feel great in my body and like works really well. And it's like making me feel alive, and I love it. And I'm going to write it down, because then like I can reread the recipe and, keep doing it for myself. And then you like shared it in the world, and you were like, hey, I don't know if other people might like want to try this out, but it's like really working for me. And there are some people who are like, oh my God, like I never would have thought to make this recipe, but now you've given me the steps to do it. And now when I eat it, like I feel really good, or I feel charged up. And then other people are like, how dare you tell me how to eat and what I'm supposed to, and how dare you shame me for, how dare you suggest that I'm supposed to be doing what you do? And I've heard you be very adamant that like, you're not prescriptive in this work, and that you're not suggesting that other people do, that everyone should host a podcast where they talk to people who have said that. Like I've heard you speak about that, but I also think that surely there is a little bit of recognition that like, I'm now, the metaphor is too strong, but like if you do something like write a diet book, right, there is the acknowledgement that like you are suggesting that this could work for other people, and you do perhaps condone other people trying it, right? Like it's not like
Yeah.
I would never, no one else will ever attempt to do
No,
this.
yeah.
You are
This
offering
is
it as a
just
possibility.
me.
Yeah,
No
yeah,
one has
yeah.
ever spoken to each other before.
Right.
I invented it. No, it's certainly a guidebook. I think cookbook is a great metaphor, as you know, you were hinting at recipes. Yeah, I also think some of our best recipes that we swear by, we have adjusted, you know, and we have been like, actually turn the oven a little lower and keep it in a little longer. And that's totally what I want people to do with this book. This is what worked for me. This is what I learned throughout this process. Everyone has to make adjustments on their own. Everyone has to figure out who they feel safe talking to. You know, I love the cookbook metaphor. Yeah, and I'm going to use it and credit you. Deal with it.
Cool. Well, that sort of really, and this is, maybe we've already talked about this enough and we can go to something else, but
yeah,
that just sort of leads me to like, what is the thing you're most excited about at the prospect of this book being in the world? And then is there anything that you're willing to share that you're like most scared of?
Yeah. Wow. Great. Most excited about the fact that what I've been hearing from readers is that this has been offering like a balm for them, that they have been aware of the friction on the internet in their families, and they kind of didn't know what to do about it. And that this book looks at that friction head on, and they feel seen. That means a lot to me. I'm excited for all of the relationships that are going to be repaired through this book, because, you know, this is ultimately, I'm practicing digital restorative justice here, right? This is not retributive. I am not trying to punish anyone. I'm trying to repair relationships rather than abandon them or mock the people who wrote these comments to me. And I'm really, really thrilled to hear about and continue to hear about. This sounds like a self-congratulatory anecdote I'm about to share, but someone was at a book signing a week ago, and this person told me that the podcast it allowed them to reconnect with their family, and they had not spoken to their family in a while. That's like the highest compliment I can ever hope to get. And not all of these relationships that are going to be repaired are going to be people on the opposite sides of the political spectrum, right? We understand that friction happens among all sorts of people. So that's what I'm most excited by. I think what I'm most scared of is, you know, I'm aware that by creating something in a physical form that is separate from me and multiplied tens of thousands of times and out in the world, that I can't control how people interpret it. Mm-hmm. And that's just like something you have to do when you part with work. I don't know why I feel more in control of the stuff I release digitally, you know, when like, it's like, oh, of course you don't. That's going to millions of people in seconds. But, you know, I get it. I think a book you read in the quiet of your mind, and that's so beautiful. And I have to release myself from the fact that like, I can't be there next to someone to give all the caveats, to be like, well, this is what I believe. And it's like, well, I kind of have to accept the fact that everyone is going to read this through their own lens, through their own eyes.
There's a chapter towards the end of, or there's a section towards the end of your book that I like truly underlined like the whole page. And also was like, oh God, like, how did you see me so clearly? And this is maybe a like for a Sarah and Dylan conversation later, but the way that you talked about watching the internet and the way that cynicism and criticism and hate
Mm,
works online and studying
Yeah.
it, thinking like, okay, if I study this, then I will be able to write the perfect sentence and or book that
Yeah.
will not upset anyone. And it's a math problem, but I will solve it by paying attention carefully to the scroll of the
Yeah.
internet. And I was like, oh no, Dylan, this is me. And I know it doesn't work and you're telling me it doesn't work, but I'm doing it anyway. It just is like really. And so I guess one of the reasons why I asked what you're afraid or what you're most scared of is like, I felt you move through that in this book.
Mm,
And I was like, wow, what a beautiful thing to see someone on the other side of the obstacle that I'm not through yet, but to be like, I actually can't, I'm no, the fact that your biggest fear is not like that people won't like it on the internet is like very important. I think that like that was both a real thing you experienced and navigated, and then we're able to be like, actually, that isn't the thing that I'm, preoccupied with, or like I understand where that is and what that doesn't have to do with, or how I can't anticipate that. And I that section specifically really spoke to me. And
Well, I just thank you for saying that. A lot of people have come up to me about that specific chapter, and I'm glad you brought it up, because that's actually the more honest answer to the question that you just asked 2 ago, which is like what I'm most afraid of. And I'm actually so afraid of it that I didn't even name it in my response to you, which is I'm afraid of being shamed for writing this book. And I'm, the common parlance for what I'm afraid of is cancel culture. But as I say in this chapter, it's like, I think the term cancel culture means so many different things to so many different people that the term has effectively lost all meaning. But I think, for lack of a better term, I fear that. I fear being canceled. I fear being shamed. And I think the most acute fear of that, what scares me most about that is that is an excommunication from my own tribe, right? And that's different from hate, because when I was receiving hate from the other side, right, that is difficult and psychologically taxing for different reasons. I'm not minimizing how much it hurts to have a stranger call me a gay slur, have a stranger send me a death threat. They just exist in opposite universes. But to get those, to get a piece of hate from the other side, actually, I was finding when I reshared it, cemented my position in my tribe. Whereas getting the kind of sometimes really vicious pushback from my side, criticisms about what I do, critiques of who I am and who I am because of this project, that's terrifying to me. And I spent so long on this book because I not only wanted to make it factually accurate, worked closely with an amazing fact checker. Just want to shout her out. Her name is Lisa. But something that Lisa couldn't check was the emotional accuracy of it. Do I believe this? And I agonized over every single sentence in this book to make sure that it was emotionally honest. And I did that not to make it critique proof, because there is no such thing, and I welcome critiques and criticism, but so that when and if that critique comes, I can fully stand by what I wrote in here. And with the hope that just as I, throughout this book, throughout this project, have given people the grace to change and grow, I hope that same grace will be granted to me. And that's just a hope. I can't control it. So that is the honest answer to the question you just asked.
Thank you. I want to remind everybody that there's a little Q&A box. And if you haven't already, you can put a question that you have for Dylan in the Q&A box, which will be the easiest place for me to see it. And I think you can also like upvote other people's. Is that a thing? Maybe not.
Oh,
Anyway.
wow.
Well, maybe I lied. If there's a up sign, press it. And if not, type in your question. But yeah, in like a minute, I will page through here and ask a couple questions from the audience. And before I do that, maybe, God, there's so much I want to talk to you about. We'll just have to talk. You and I will just have to talk more. Sorry to everybody else who doesn't get to witness me just like freaking out about this book. I just want to say that there's a lot in this book that I really genuinely like had to stop and be like, wow, I can't believe he found language for that. Like, this is a thing that I have experienced or I feel, but I would never have been able to like get it and put language into it. And also just because I'm like a structure nerd, I am also like really moved by the structure of this book and like the way you moved through it as a story, and also with sort of like lessons, but not prescriptive lessons. It just on like a craft level, this book is really beautiful. Like we've talked a lot about like the project and the work, capital W, of empathy building, but I also just think the book is really beautiful and very well written. And like I cried multiple times. That's for real. I wrote, because I was underlining things, and every time I laughed out loud, I put a little smiley face. Every time I started crying, I didn't know how to like, because I didn't want to put a sad face. So instead I just wrote the letter T, and I was like, that's for tears.
Wow. Oh my God, I got it. This is going to sell on eBay. This book of yours is going to sell on eBay.
Copy.
Wow.
Okay, cool. Maybe let me get some of the questions.
I just want to say that's a huge, a true, astounding honor coming from you. I'm a huge fan of yours, and that you said that about my writing. Like, I think I'm going to privately cry about that later tonight.
I really mean it. And I think also like poetry, you know, so I think so much of what the work of poetry often is, not always, but often, is like trying to put language to what is unlanguageable. And I think like by virtue of the internet being new, by virtue of the internet sometimes being written off as like a thing that it is either like corny or impossible to like treat with literary vigor. I think like we haven't, or I haven't experienced a lot of your artfulness of language with something like the internet and internet culture. And I think you have found language for something as unlanguageable as like unlanguageable for different reasons, but like what has felt unlanguageable. So I really appreciated that. Okay, let me ask you some of these other people questions.
Okay, other people questions.
And then reserving the right to maybe ask you like one more question at the end. Okay.
Yeah. Reserve.
Oh my gosh, so many good questions. Okay. I would like to ask you, there's so many like lovely things. Let's do this one. An anonymous attendee wants to know if there are books or podcasts or other forms of media that have been especially inspirational for you, or that you feel that you have learned from and that has informed your own approach to podcasting and writing.
Yes. This is not something I found or was even available when the podcast started or when this project started, but it is a stunning example of stuff I do in the book. And it's a documentary called The Painter and the Thief. And it is about, have you seen it?
I just love the title.
Oh my God. It is about a relationship that this painter, who at the peak of her career creates these two pieces that are she has this gallery showing that is, and this is all in Europe. And she has this gallery showing of what is meant to be her, like, you know, her magnum opus. And two of the paintings are stolen. She finds one of the people who stole the painting and develops a relationship with him and tries to track it down with him. It is one of the most arresting pieces of art that I've ever seen.
Amazing.
Yeah,
thank you.
Love it. Please check it out.
And similar, just because it's related, Jack Kleiner also wanted to know if there were any resources or that you recommend people checking out on like the activism that is building up rather than tearing down. Not to say that there isn't space
Mm.
for tearing down systems also, but Jack is
Mhm.
specifically asking if there are things you want to shout out in the sort of like restorative area of activism.
Yeah, well, this is more a person who I'm directing you to, but there's a woman named Sujata Baliga, who is a restorative justice practitioner. She's amazing. I met her actually 4 years ago. And I think just like hearing more about restorative justice from her has been incredible. There are books that I'm looking at on my shelf that I have ordered and have not read yet. But there's one book I haven't read that is just on my list. I need to, is We Will Not Cancel Us, which is a book that so many people have told me about it. I finally read it, or I finally ordered it, need to read it. I'm looking at it on my shelf, which is about the need for coalition building. Or I suppose I can't talk about a book I haven't read yet. I believe it is about coalition building on one side. Other things. I feel like there are a lot of articles that are now not coming to mind because they don't like exist on my bookshelves. But something I think, I read John Ronson's seminal book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, in 2015, or that's when it was published. I read it as I was beginning this project. I mean, that book is just as relevant today as it was then. And I actually reread it while writing this book. And it's really brilliant, and it's alarmingly prescient. It's like really troublingly relevant. Loretta J. Ross is another person who, I believe she has a book coming out, but she has long advocated and long been an advocate for calling in without making an inch of concession on her progressive platform.
Thank you. I'm going to connect two other questions. They're not exactly the same, but they're sort of touching on a similar theme.
Can I add one more book? One more
please.
book that is huge for me. Conflict is Not Abuse by Sarah Schulman. Done.
Great. So someone wrote this lovely comment that I won't read all of because it's long, but it's just that that they had read that you're interested in comedy sketch work. That sort of originated in your desire to collaborate with other passionate and creative people. And they noticed that humor has seemed to play a big role, whether in your podcast or also now in your new work for Ted Lasso. And they wanted to know about what humor's place is in your writing and how humor contributes to the work that you do. And then someone else was specifically asking about what drew you to experimental theater and your background performing with the New York Neo-Futurists, and how that might have impacted your approach either to your podcast or to your writing work. So not necessarily together, but a little bit about humor and a little bit about the Neo-Futurists.
They actually go together quite well. So go off you for connecting them. So sketch comedy in college was a beacon for me. Sketch comedy was like, you're telling me that I don't just when you're in high school, there are very few ends to creative work, right? It's like you are a writer, you are a painter, you are an actor, you play an instrument, right? Like that's it. Sketch comedy cracked that open for me because I was like, you're telling me I can have a group of friends and we can create stuff together about our community and the way we see the world that we find funny. An audience will find that funny. And then we just get to perform it and write that. That was mind-blowing to me. I think my relationship with comedy kind of changed a little because, and this is what I'm about to say is antithetical to comedy, and the best comedians I know kind of don't necessarily get bogged down by this question, but I did, which is I couldn't access the why. I couldn't always access the why of comedy, and I always had to, maybe to my detriment as a comedian, which is why that's a path I didn't pursue, as I was obsessed with well, what's the point of this? What's the point of this sketch? What's the point of this joke? What is it saying? And so I think this is why pairing these questions worked so well. When I found the theater company, the New York Neo-Futurists, I was not tethered by the need to be funny. And of course, when you're not tethered by the need to be funny, that's when your mind can run wild. And I think I did my most comedic work then, because it's just like when you're told like, you must do this. And you're like, it's when someone's like, okay, be funny right now. I like freeze up. I just want to say comedy is an art form that I am fascinated by, that I worship and just think is incredible and done by some of the most talented, brilliant people I know. I think though that I wanted to use it more as a tool to say something rather than I was a student of the medium itself. And anyway, so that's how I found experimental theater. And then from that experimental theater company, the New York Neo-Futurists, that's where like I really like ran wild creatively. And that's where I created every single word, because I did it as a theater piece. I performed every single word spoken by a person of color in the Julia Louis-Dreyfus rom-com Enough Said, because that week I was the only person of color in that night's show. And I was like, oh, this can turn into an interesting digital project. Anyway, we could get into the nuances of my resume, which we absolutely shouldn't do. But comedy for me has to come naturally. It has to come like, I think there are a lot of funny moments and conversations with people who hate me. And I think that I like when I get to joke with a guest. I like when we find a track of making fun of each other, and I'm always down to make fun of myself. But I think, God, what a long and technical answer for such a beautiful question. I think the way I use comedy for my own work, not the work, when I'm part of a bigger team, is that I think that comedy is like the greatest candy coating for medicine. It's like the most perfectly digestible shell for big ideas to go down.
That's actually a pretty good transition back to the thing that I wanted to tell you, which is that you have, again, maybe because I'm a poet and I'm coming to it from that, but I was so impressed by the metaphors in this book. And I think about them all the time. So like candied kale, is that what it is?
Candied kale, yeah.
Yeah, candied kale as like a concept, but also like the metaphors of dance as conversation and debate as sport, and the armies of the internet that assemble to take people down. I just think that you're very deft with metaphor, and it's like a lovely example of how I think people associate metaphor with poetry all the time, but they don't always recognize how powerful metaphor is in our lives, completely separate from sort of formal poetry. And I think you're doing a really great job of giving people metaphors to allow them to make sense of, again, something that feels like very intangible and also like intense and sort of overwhelming. And so to be able to kind of like piece out like, well, here's an image for you to hold on to, and is just super, super useful. So everyone that's a
real honor from you. Like we're talking the queen of metaphors. That's like truly like Beyonce complimenting,
but an appreciator, a big appreciator of metaphors. Des Martin wanted to know, have you followed up with any of your guests that you interviewed? And if you did, have any of them changed at all? And to Des, I say, you'll just have to read the book.
So Des, great question. So you should read the book, and I won't tell you about the big change that happens in the book. But I am in touch with all of them. The book opens with a person who I refer to as Josh, and he and I have been in touch since. We even just reunited on the Today Show. We had our first face-to-face Zoom meeting on a segment with Jenna and Hoda. But I also sent an early copy of this book to all of the guests that I spotlight in the book. And I let them know that the book was happening, that the book was a thing. And, you know, I'm in touch with all of them in the sense that we're still texting. But I would say Josh is the person who I've remained closest to from this whole thing. He was also my very first conversation.
That's really exciting that you sent the book to all of those people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really, you first.
No, please. My main question is like, did anyone have a response that either surprised you or stuck with you?
No, I think like they all responded when I told them like, hey, I wrote a book and I wrote about our conversation and you're in it and I want you to read it before it comes out. I think, you know, you are owed that. I think what helped me not worry about sending it to them was that one, my blessed fact checker was there to make sure that like not a single quote was misquoted, you know, and that I wasn't taking a quote like grossly or not even grossly, just at all out of context. So it's like, oh, that's not what they were saying. So I had other eyes on it. So I sent it to them with the confidence of like, this is true for me. And it's also true for capital T, the truth, you know? But I also wonder, because I heard back from all of them, they were like, oh my God, so excited, please send it to me. And then I didn't hear back from some of them. And I wonder if they didn't want to read it, which I totally respect, you know? So yeah.
Yeah. I want us to be able to close out with Rachel. She's going to come back and give us some more hot tips from Brookline Booksmith. But before I bring her back, I just want to say thank you to everybody for your wonderful questions. I'm sorry that I couldn't get to all of them, but we did cover a whole bunch of them, and they are all excellent. And also, Dylan, just thank you for writing this book and chatting with me about it. I really do have like several pages of more questions. So unfortunately, I will be asking them of you just in a private space.
Listen, I'm ready for all of that. I'm ready for all of that.
But I really, really appreciate so much in this book. And I think there's a lot people are going to get out of this book. I said this online and it was sort of tongue in cheek, but then I really meant it, which is like, if I could assign freshman reading for the internet, which is to say like, you have to do the reading before you can use the internet. This book would absolutely be a part of that, because I just think that it really does give us a lot to think about in language that is approachable, with a heart that is caring and like very, very generous, which I think is something that, you know, we could all use a little more grace and generosity with each other and also with ourselves. And I think you just model that really beautifully in this book. So thank you so much for it. And I'll let you have the last word, but then let Rachel come in.
Well, I just, listen, that means the world to me. And that was what I set out to do when I wrote this book. And I think that's why I took so much time with it, because I wanted to get it right. And I think in a world that celebrates quick and fast and highly visible and virality, I wanted to tune that out. And the fact that I aimed for something and you recognize that as succeeding, I am ready to soar off into the clouds. So thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Back to you, Rachel.
Rachel, last Brookline event.
Did we do it? Did we do it?
You did. It was great. You didn't embarrass me at all.
Who doesn't know, this is Rachel's last Brookline event, and we are here to celebrate her.
Thank you. I swore we were here to celebrate your book.
No. This was all a ruse. It's not even real. These pages are all blank. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much to the two of you for this just incredibly thoughtful and vulnerable conversation that you had. I was getting lost in it, and I had to keep reminding myself to look at the clock to like pay attention to when I had to get back on. And also to all of you in the chat, this has been one of the loveliest conversations I've ever seen. There is so much warmth and connection, and it just feels so perfect for this book. So truly, thank you all for being here as part of the Booksmith community tonight. For those of you who haven't yet had a chance to purchase your books with signed book plates, thank you, Dylan. You can do so through the page where you registered through 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, and otherwise see if you can grab a copy from our shelves if there are any left, because I think these are going to be quite popular.
Wow.
Support your local indie bookstore. If
Yes.
you can buy
And
this
fabulous
book.
authors.
Yes.
Please also find Sarah Kay's poetry, everything Sarah Kay. Sarah Kay is incredible. I am obsessed, a fan. Please, she's amazing. Oh, and we got a model. We got a book model.
She's mainly a book model of this book. Yes.
And that's what I paid you for.
Thank you, Brookline Booksmith. Thank you, Dylan. Everybody, support your local indie bookstore and your local wonderful author.